The silence before the fire. There are places on Earth where time is not measured in days, but in breaths. Where mountains are not merely rock, but memory. Where the ground holds ancient secrets, whispered in tremors that only the attentive can hear. The island of Flores, in Indonesia, is one of those places. It rests in the heart of the Pacific Ring of Fire, that incandescent band that embraces entire continents, where tectonic plates meet, collide, and release forces that have shaped the very face of the planet. There, between the deep blue of the ocean and the dense green of tropical forests, rise two sister mountains, Lewotobi Laki-Laki, the masculine Lewotobi, Perempuan, the feminine. For centuries, the people of Flores have lived in the shadow of these two presences. They planted their crops in volcanic soil, built their homes on the slopes, created their stories, and they learned to listen. Because in a land like this, listening is not optional. It is survival. In 2025, the modern world, accustomed to forgetting that the Earth still moves, was reminded of this in the most dramatic way possible. On the day Lewotobi Laki-Laki awoke, the sky above Flores disappeared. A column of ash, more than 18 kilometers high, rose like a spear of darkness toward the stratosphere. Satellites captured the image. Aircraft diverted their routes. Entire cities were covered by a grey snow, hot and suffocating. But this was not a sudden tragedy. It was the conclusion of a story that had been written for years, perhaps decades, beneath the surface. The residents knew. They felt the nighttime tremors that made bowls rattle on shelves. They saw the light smoke rising from the crater, still timid. They heard the muffled sounds coming from inside the mountain, as if something ancient was stirring in its sleep. Scientists knew, too. Modern instruments detected inflation in the crust, increased sulfuric gases, revealing seismic patterns. The magma was rising, slowly, silently, inevitably, and then, in July 2025, it broke through. Lewotobi Laki-Laki did not simply erupt. It announced to the world that it was still alive. That the planet, however silent it may seem in its vastness, has never stopped pulsing. And that we, human beings, are still only temporary visitors on an Earth that operates on timescales we can barely comprehend. But here is the question that keeps scientists awake at night. Was the eruption of 2025 the end, or just the beginning? Because volcanoes, unlike us, are in no hurry. They wait, they accumulate. And when they finally speak, they rarely say everything at once. This is the account of that awakening. Of a mountain that remains silent long enough for the world to forget it. And of what may be coming when the year 2026 dawns over the still smoking slopes of Flores. This is a story shaped by time and patience. If you choose to remain with us, the Earth is about to reveal one of its quietest and most powerful transformations. Because Lewotobi Laki-Laki has not finished speaking. And what it has to say next may change everything. The island that remembers. Flores is not a large island. On a map of Indonesia, it appears as a slender thread stretched across the lesser Sunda Islands, barely visible among the thousands of fragments that make up this volcanic archipelago. But size, in geology, means nothing. What matters is position. And Flores sits exactly where the Earth is most restless. Beneath this island, 3 tectonic plates converge in a slow, inexorable dance that has lasted millions of years. The Australian plate pushes northward. The Eurasian plate resists. The Pacific plate slides beneath them both, descending into the mantle in a process called subduction, the engine that powers nearly every volcano in the Ring of Fire. This is not abstract science. This is the reason Flores exists at all. Every mountain on this island was born from violence. Every valley was carved by flows of molten rock. Every fertile field owes its richness to ash that once burned. The people of Flores have always understood this bargain. They live on land that can give abundantly and take everything away in a single afternoon. The twin peaks of Lewotobi have been part of this landscape for so long that local tradition no longer remembers when they first appeared. Legends speak of them as husband and wife, male and female, two halves of a single spirit. Lewotobi Laki-Laki, the masculine peak, stands at 1,584 meters. Its summit is sharp, aggressive, crowned by a crater that has never fully closed. Lewotobi Perempuan, the feminine peak, rises slightly higher at 1,703 meters. Her slopes are gentler, her presence quieter, but in recent decades it has been the masculine peak that has demanded attention. Records from the Smithsonian Global Volcanism Program show that Lewotobi Laki-Laki has erupted multiple times in modern history. Small events, mostly phreatic explosions, bursts of steam and ash when water meets hot rock. Brief reminders that the mountain is never truly asleep. But in the years leading up to 2025, something changed. The tremors became more frequent, not violent, not dramatic, but persistent. The kind of seismic activity that suggests movement deep below, magma pushing upward, finding pathways through fractured rock. Gas emissions increased. Sulfur dioxide began appearing in concentrations that could be measured from space. The ground itself began to swell. Instruments recorded what geologists call inflation, the slow rise of the surface as magma accumulates beneath it, like a balloon being filled with air. All of this was documented, monitored, reported, and still, when the eruption came, it shocked the world. Because there is a difference between knowing a volcano is active and witnessing what that truly means. On July 8, 2025, at approximately 3:47 in the afternoon local time, Lewotobi Laki-Laki unleashed an explosion that sent ash 18 kilometers into the sky.
Before we continue this story, subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us tell the true stories of Earth's most powerful volcanoes.
The eruption column rose with terrifying speed, punching through cloud layers, spreading into a mushroom shape that could be seen from neighboring islands. Pyroclastic flows, superheated avalanches of gas and rock, raced down the mountainous flanks at hundreds of kilometers per hour. Villages nearest the crater were evacuated within hours. Thousands of people fled, carrying what they could. Ash fell like black snow over towns dozens of kilometers away. Roofs collapsed under its weight. Crops were buried. Water sources turned gray and undrinkable. International flights rerouted. Airlines suspended service to the region. The ash, carried by high-altitude winds, drifted across Southeast Asia. And then, after 3 days of continuous eruption, the mountain fell silent again. But this was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a held breath. Because the magma that fed that eruption did not vanish. It simply stopped rising. For now, scientists analyzing the event noted something troubling. The volume of material ejected in July 2025, while significant, was not enough to fully depressurize the system. Seismic data suggested that large reservoirs of magma remained beneath the volcano. In other words, Lewotobi Laki-Laki had spoken. But it had not said everything. And as 2025 gave way to 2026, the question was no longer whether the volcano would erupt again. The question was when. The architecture of fire to understand what happened in 2025. And what may come in 2026, we must first descend, not into the crater itself, though that is where the story becomes visible, but deeper, into the hidden architecture beneath the mountain, into the realm where rock melts and pressure builds and the earth reveals its true nature. This is not a journey for the impatient. The forces that power a volcano like Lewotobi Laki-Laki operate on timescales that dwarf human lifetimes. What we witness as an eruption, dramatic, sudden, complete, is merely the final act of a process that may have begun decades, even centuries, earlier. Beneath Flores, at depths of 60 to 100 kilometers, the edge of the Australian plate is being forced downward into the mantle. This is subduction. The grinding descent of one piece of the Earth's crust beneath another. As the plate sinks, it carries with it something unexpected. Water, seawater, trapped in cracks and minerals, pulled down into the furnace of the mantle. And when that water encounters temperatures above 1000 degrees Celsius, something remarkable happens. It causes the surrounding rock to melt, not completely, not all at once, but enough to create pockets of molten material, magma, that are lighter than the solid rock around them, and lighter things rise. Slowly, over years, this magma begins its ascent. It collects in chambers, vast reservoirs of molten rock that can sit beneath a volcano for generations, waiting for pressure to build, waiting for pathways to open, waiting for the moment when the weight of the overlying rock can no longer contain it. This is what was happening beneath Lewotobi Laki-Laki in the years before 2025. The magma was rising. Scientists could see its signature in the seismic data, small earthquakes clustered at specific depths, marking the fractures as rock broke under stress. They could measure the inflation of the surface, the subtle swelling of the mountain as magma accumulated beneath the summit. But magma alone does not cause an eruption. What drives the explosion is something else: gas. Dissolved within the molten rock are enormous quantities of volcanic gases, water vapor, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide. At depth, under immense pressure, these gases remain trapped in the liquid. But, as magma rises and pressure decreases, they begin to separate. Like opening a bottle of champagne. When enough gas accumulates, when pressure exceeds the strength of the rock above, the system fails. The mountain ruptures, and what emerges is not simply lava flowing gently downslope. It is an explosion. In July 2025, that is precisely what occurred. The eruption of Lewotobi Laki-Laki was classified as volcanic, a type of explosive event characterized by violent bursts of gas and ash. The eruption column, 18 kilometers high, was driven not by the gradual rise of lava, but by the catastrophic release of pressurized gas. Pyroclastic flows, those deadly currents of superheated gas, ash, and rock fragments, swept down the mountainside at speeds exceeding 200 kilometers per hour. They consumed everything in their path. Trees were incinerated. Buildings were flattened. The heat alone, reaching temperatures of several hundred degrees, was enough to ignite organic material before the flow even arrived. And yet, for all its violence, this eruption was relatively brief. 3 days of sustained activity. Then silence. What does that tell us? It tells us that the pressure was relieved, but not exhausted. That the magma chamber beneath Lewotobi Laki-Laki was tapped, but not emptied. That the volcano reached an equilibrium, a temporary balance between the forces pushing upward and the strength of the rock holding them back. But equilibrium, in a volcanic system, is rarely permanent. Even now, months later, instruments around the volcano continue to record activity. Small earthquakes, elevated gas emissions, subtle ground deformation. The magma is still there, still accumulating, still seeking release. Some scientists believe that the eruption of 2025 may have been only the first in a series. That Lewotobi Laki-Laki has entered an active phase that could last months or years. Others suggest that the volcano may pause, that it may take decades to rebuild the pressure necessary for another major event. Both scenarios are possible. Both have precedent in the geological record. What is certain is this: the mountain has not finished its work, and the people of Flores, living once again in the shadow of the Twin Peaks, know that the silence they hear now is not the silence of rest. It is the silence of patience. The earth, after all, has all the time in the world. The human margin there is a peculiar mathematics that governs life near a volcano. On one side of the equation, fertile soil, abundant water, breathtaking beauty, land that can grow 3 harvests a year, hillsides draped in green, rivers fed by mountain springs. On the other side, the possibility that everything can vanish in an afternoon. For the people of Flores, this has never been an abstraction. When Lewotobi Laki-Laki erupted in July 2025, more than 10,000 people were evacuated from villages within a 10-kilometer radius of the crater. They left behind homes built by their grandparents, fields planted weeks earlier, livestock that could not be moved in time. They carried what they could in bundles and bags: children, photographs, tools, and they walked down roads covered in ash toward evacuation centers in the lowlands, not knowing when or if they would return. This is the human margin of volcanic eruption. The space between warning and disaster, between preparation and loss. In the days following the initial explosion, ash continued to fall across a region spanning hundreds of square kilometers. Roofs, not designed to bear such weight, collapsed in villages that had seemed safely distant. Rice fields turned gray and lifeless. Water sources became contaminated with sulfuric compounds, undrinkable without treatment. The ash itself was not merely an inconvenience. Volcanic ash is not like the soft residue of a wood fire. It is pulverized rock and glass, sharp, abrasive, capable of destroying engines, contaminating water supplies, and causing respiratory illness in those exposed for prolonged periods. For the elderly, particularly those with existing lung conditions, the ash posed a serious health risk. For children, whose smaller airways are more vulnerable, the danger was equally acute. Evacuation centers, hastily established in schools and community buildings, sheltered thousands, but these were not designed for long-term occupation. Families slept on mats. Supplies of clean water and food required constant replenishment. Medical staff worked to monitor for respiratory infections and other ash-related illnesses. And still, the question hung over everything. How long? How long would they need to stay away? How long before the volcano quieted? How long before it was safe to return? In the first week, there was no answer. The volcano continued its activity. Small explosions, ongoing ash emissions. The exclusion zone remained in place. But by the second week, something shifted. The seismic activity began to decrease. The ash column diminished. Monitoring stations reported lower levels of sulfur dioxide. The volcano, it seemed, was entering a quieter phase. Authorities made the decision to allow residents to return, albeit with caution. Evacuation orders were lifted for all but the nearest villages. Thousands began the journey back up the mountain. What they found was a landscape transformed. Homes buried under 1/2 meter of ash, gardens destroyed, water cisterns filled with grey sludge. The work of rebuilding would take months. And yet, they stayed. Because this is what people do in volcanic regions. They adapt, they rebuild. They return to the slopes, knowing the mountain may wake again. It is a choice shaped by generations, by cultural identity, by economic necessity, and by something less tangible, a relationship with the land that outsiders often struggle to understand. The soil that buries your home one year will feed your children the next. But the eruption of 2025 also revealed something else. The limits of preparedness. Indonesia is no stranger to volcanic disasters. The nation monitors more than 100 active volcanoes through a network of seismic stations, gas sensors, and satellite observation. The Center for Volcanology and Geological Hazard Mitigation in Bandung operates one of the most sophisticated volcano monitoring systems in the world. And yet, even with all that technology, the eruption of Lewotobi Laki-Laki caught communities off guard. Not because scientists failed to detect the warning signs, they did. The data was there. The inflation, the gas emissions, the seismic swarms, all were documented in the weeks before July 8. But translating scientific data into effective public action is not always straightforward. Warnings must be clear. Evacuation routes must be established. Communities must trust the authorities issuing those warnings. And people must be willing to leave, even when the mountain looks quiet. In the case of Lewotobi, many residents had grown accustomed to the volcano's minor eruptions over the years. Small ash bursts, brief episodes of activity, nothing catastrophic. When the warnings escalated in early July, some chose to wait, to watch, to see if this time would be different. By the time the full violence of the eruption became clear, escape routes were already choked with ash and panicked traffic. Fortunately, the death toll was limited. A few lives lost to collapsing structures and pyroclastic flows, but it could have been far worse. And as scientists reviewed the event in the months that followed, one conclusion became unavoidable. Lewotobi Laki-Laki had not shown its full strength. The July eruption, while dramatic, was likely only a partial release of the pressure building beneath the mountain. The magma chamber remained active. The potential for future eruptions, possibly larger ones, remained real. And so, the question facing the people of Flores as 2026 began was not whether the volcano would erupt again. It was whether they would be ready when it did. The language of warning. There is a language spoken beneath every active volcano. A language older than words, written in tremors and gas plumes and the subtle rise and fall of the ground itself. Scientists call it monitoring. But in truth, it is translation. The earth is always speaking. The question is whether we are listening carefully enough to understand what it is trying to say. In the months following the July 2025 eruption, the network of instruments surrounding Lewotobi Laki-Laki became one of the most closely watched volcanic monitoring systems in Southeast Asia. Seismometers, buried in the ground at various distances from the crater, recorded every vibration, every earthquake, no matter how small, every tremor that rippled through the rock as magma moved, as gases percolated upward, as the mountain adjusted to the new pressures within it. GPS stations measured ground deformation with millimeter precision. If the surface swelled even slightly, a sign that magma was accumulating beneath, the instruments would detect it. Gas sensors analyzed the composition of emissions from the crater. Sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide. The ratios between them could reveal whether fresh magma was rising from depth, or whether the system was merely degassing older material. Satellite imagery, captured daily, tracked thermal anomalies, hotspots, where heat from below was reaching the surface. These could indicate new vents opening, or lava beginning to accumulate in the crater. All of this data flowed continuously to the Center for Volcanology and Geological Hazard Mitigation in Bandung, where scientists worked to interpret what the mountain was telling them. And what they heard, in the autumn of 2025, was not silence. Lewotobi Laki-Laki remained restless. Small earthquakes continued. Clustered at depths of 5 to 10 kilometers, precisely the range where magma chambers are typically found. The frequency was lower than during the July eruption, but the pattern was unmistakable. The volcano was not dormant. It was recharging. Gas emissions remained elevated. not at crisis levels, but above baseline. The volcano was still breathing. Ground deformation showed a slow, steady inflation. The summit was rising, measurably, month by month. Something was accumulating beneath it. This is where the science becomes both precise and maddeningly uncertain. The data can tell you what is happening. It cannot always tell you what will happen next. Volcanoes do not operate on schedules. They do not announce their intentions. A volcano can show every sign of imminent eruption and then fall silent for years. Or it can erupt with little warning after months of apparent calm. The challenge for scientists is to recognize patterns, to identify which signals indicate an eruption is hours or days away, and which suggest the volcano may continue in its current state indefinitely. In the case of Lewotobi Laki-Laki, the consensus among volcanologists as 2025 drew to a close was cautious but clear. The volcano had not finished its eruptive cycle. The July event was likely the beginning of a period of heightened activity that could last months or years. Additional eruptions were probable. Their timing and intensity remained uncertain. 3 scenarios emerged as the most likely possibilities for 2026. The first, a series of smaller intermittent eruptions, brief explosions, ash emissions, pyroclastic flows, confined to the upper slopes. Disruptive, but manageable. This is a common pattern for volcanoes entering active phases. The pressure builds, releases partially, builds again. A volcanic rhythm that can continue for years. The second, a single, larger eruption, an event potentially surpassing the intensity of July 2025. If the magma chamber continued to accumulate material without significant release, the eventual eruption could be more powerful, more destructive. This scenario kept emergency planners awake at night. The third, extended quiet, a deceptive calm. The volcano could enter a period of minimal surface activity while magma continued to accumulate at depth. This is perhaps the most psychologically dangerous scenario because it allows complacency to creep in. People return. Development resumes. And when the volcano finally does erupt, the impact is magnified by the false sense of security. All 3 scenarios had precedent in the historical record of similar volcanoes across Indonesia and the Pacific Rim. And so, as the calendar turned to 2026, the people of Flores found themselves living in a state of informed uncertainty. They knew the mountain was active. They knew another eruption was possible, even likely, but they did not know when, or how severe it would be. This is the reality of coexistence with volcanic landscapes. The science provides guidance, not guarantees. And life continues, measured in the space between warnings. Stories like this are not meant to be rushed. They are meant to be followed by those who still listen. If this journey resonates with you, you are already part of Fury of the Earth. Because the conversation between the mountain and those who watch it is far from over. And the next words spoken may come without much warning at all. Volcanoes have longer memories than we do. What we experience as a single eruption, a moment of violence, a day of terror, a year of recovery, is, to the mountain, merely a breath in a conversation that spans millennia. To understand what Lewotobi Laki-Laki may do in 2026, it helps to know what it has done before. The historical record, assembled painstakingly by volcanologists from written accounts, oral traditions, and geological evidence, reveals a mountain that has never been truly quiet. The earliest documented eruption of Lewotobi Laki-Laki dates to 1660 Dutch colonial records. Fragmentary and often second-hand, mention fire and smoke rising from the Twin Peaks, villages abandoned, crops destroyed by ash. The account is brief, but the message is clear. This volcano has been disrupting human life for as long as humans have lived near it. In 1849, another major eruption. Ash fell as far as the coastal towns, choking harbors, coating ships. The eruption lasted several weeks. In 1938, a series of explosions sent pyroclastic flows down the southern flank, destroying forests and burying streams under meters of volcanic debris. And then, more recently, a pattern of smaller events: 1951, 1963, 2003, 2012. Each time, the volcano reminded the island that it was still present, still active, still capable of reshaping the landscape. But these historical eruptions, while informative, reveal only part of the story. The deeper memory, the one written in layers of ash and lava buried in the mountain's flanks, extends much further back. Geologists studying the stratigraphy of Lewotobi have identified evidence of far larger eruptions in the distant past. Events that would dwarf anything witnessed in modern times. Thick deposits of pumice and ash, spread across the island, testify to explosions that sent material tens of kilometers into the atmosphere. These were not merely disruptive. They were transformative. In geological terms, Lewotobi Laki-Laki is what is known as a stratovolcano, a steep-sided mountain built up over millennia. By alternating layers of lava flows, ash, and pyroclastic material. This architecture is both beautiful and dangerous. Beautiful, because it creates the iconic conical shape we associate with classic volcanoes. Dangerous, because stratovolcanoes are prone to explosive eruptions. The magma that feeds them tends to be viscous, rich in silica, resistant to flow. It traps gases, builds pressure. And when it finally breaks through, the result is violence. Mount St. Helens, Mount Vesuvius, Mount Pitt, all capable of catastrophic eruptions. Lewotobi Laki-Laki belongs to this family. And the July 2025 eruption, viewed through this lens, begins to look less like an anomaly and more like a return to form. The geological evidence suggests that Lewotobi undergoes periods of heightened activity separated by decades or centuries of relative calm. The mountain builds pressure slowly, erupts in clusters of events over months or years, and then subsides again. If this pattern holds, then the July 2025 eruption was likely not an isolated event. It was the opening note of a sequence. What comes next depends on factors both observable and hidden. Observable, the rate at which magma is entering the system from below, the volume of the magma chamber, the pathways available for that magma to reach the surface. Hidden, the exact composition of the magma, the distribution of gases within it, the structural integrity of the rock surrounding the chamber. Any one of these factors can shift the balance between a minor eruption and a major catastrophe. Scientists studying Lewotobi in late 2025 noted something particularly concerning. The seismic signatures suggested that magma was still being supplied to the system at depth. The source had not shut off. The volcano was still being fed. This is not unusual in active volcanic zones. But it does mean that the potential for future eruptions remains high. One point of reference often cited by researchers is the behavior of similar volcanoes in Indonesia. Following major eruptions, Mount Merapi, on the island of Java, entered an active phase in 2010 with a series of explosive eruptions that lasted several weeks. It then continued to produce smaller eruptions intermittently for years afterward, even as people returned to the slopes and rebuilt their lives. Mount Sinabung in Sumatra awoke in 2010 after 4 centuries of dormancy. Its eruptions continued, on and off, for nearly a decade. Entire villages were permanently abandoned. Exclusion zones remained in place for years. These examples illustrate a crucial point. Volcanic eruptions are not single events, they are processes, and once that process begins, it can be difficult to predict when it will end. For the people of Flores, this means navigating a future defined by uncertainty. They cannot know if 2026 will bring another explosive eruption like the one in July. They cannot know if the volcano will settle into a pattern of smaller, more frequent events. They cannot know if the mountain will fall silent for years, only to awaken again when memory has faded. What they do know is this: the mountain has spoken, and it rarely speaks only once. The Earth, after all, operates on its own timeline, a timeline in which human lifespans are barely noticeable, a timeline in which 100 years is nothing more than a pause between sentences. And Lewotobi Laki-Laki, having been silent for so long, may have much more to say. The ripple beyond the island when a volcano erupts, the impact is never confined to the slopes immediately surrounding it. The effects ripple outward, through the atmosphere, across trade routes, into global systems we rarely think about until they are disrupted. Lewotobi Laki-Laki, remote as it may seem on the map of Indonesia, sits at a crossroads of consequence. The ash column that rose 18 kilometers into the sky in July 2025 did not simply fall back to Earth on Flores. It entered the stratosphere, where high-altitude winds carried it across Southeast Asia. Within 48 hours, aviation authorities in Singapore, Malaysia, and northern Australia issued warnings. Airlines rerouted flights. Some suspended service entirely to the region. The ash, invisible at cruising altitude but deadly to jet engines, posed a risk no carrier was willing to take. This is not a minor inconvenience. It is a disruption that cascades through supply chains, tourism, and economies already fragile from years of pandemic recovery. Flores itself is not a major hub, but the airspace above it is part of a corridor connecting Australia to Asia. Thousands of flights pass through this region every month. Rerouting them adds hours, burns additional fuel, delays shipments of perishable goods. For an eruption lasting 3 days, the cost to the aviation industry alone was measured in tens of millions of dollars. And that was just the beginning. Volcanic ash, once it settles, does not disappear. On Flores, it contaminated water supplies for weeks. Municipal treatment facilities were overwhelmed. Bottled water had to be brought in from neighboring islands. Agriculture, the lifeblood of the island's economy, suffered severe losses. Rice paddies buried under ash, coffee plantations coated in a grey layer that killed young plants, livestock affected by respiratory distress and contaminated feed. The immediate damage was estimated in the tens of millions. But the long-term impact, the loss of future harvests, the soil degradation, the displacement of farming families was harder to quantify. Tourism, a growing sector on Flores, came to a halt. The island is known for its natural beauty. For Komodo dragons on the neighboring island of Komodo, for dive sites and traditional villages. But images of the eruption, the ash-covered towns, the evacuations, the pyroclastic flows, sent a different message to the world. Flores became, in the global imagination, a place of danger. Bookings evaporated. Hotels sat empty. Guides had no clients. And yet, for all this regional disruption, Lewotobi Laki-Laki did not achieve what some had feared most: a climate impact. Large volcanic eruptions can affect global temperatures. When Mount Pinatubo erupted in the Philippines in 1991, it injected millions of tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. The gas formed a haze of sulfuric acid droplets that reflected sunlight back into space, cooling the planet by roughly 0.5 degrees Celsius for more than a year. Lewotobi's July eruption, while violent, was not large enough to produce that kind of effect. The volume of sulfur dioxide released was significant but localized. It dissipated within weeks. Still, the event served as a reminder of what is possible. Indonesia lies along one of the most volcanically active zones on Earth. The archipelago contains more than 120 active volcanoes. Some are monitored closely, others, in more remote regions, are watched less rigorously. If Lewotobi Laki-Laki were to produce a much larger eruption in 2026, the kind of event suggested by the geological record of its distant past, the consequences could extend far beyond Flores. A sustained eruption, lasting weeks or months, could disrupt air travel across the entire Indo-Pacific region. It could affect monsoon patterns. It could send ash drifting as far as the Indian Ocean or the Western Pacific. This is not speculation, it is precedent. The eruption of Mount Agung on the nearby island of Bali in 1963 killed more than 1,000 people and disrupted weather patterns across the region. Ash from that eruption was detected thousands of kilometers away. The question facing scientists and policymakers as 2026 began was not whether Lewotobi could produce such an event. The question was whether it would. And if it did, whether the world was prepared to respond. Because volcanic eruptions, unlike many natural disasters, do not respect borders. Ash clouds drift where the wind takes them. Economic disruptions spread through interconnected systems. Humanitarian crises require international coordination. The eruption of 2025 tested regional response mechanisms, evacuation protocols, aid distribution, communication networks, and while the response was largely effective, gaps were identified. Some villages lacked adequate early warning systems. Some evacuation centers were undersupplied. Some communication channels broke down under the strain. These are lessons that must be learned. Because if Lewotobi Laki-Laki erupts again in 2026, and the data suggests it very well might, there may not be time to improvise. The mountain will not wait for us to be ready. It will speak when it is ready to speak. And the world, ready or not, will have to listen. Because that is the nature of living on a planet that is still being shaped. A planet where the forces that built continents are still at work. Where mountains are not static monuments, but living, breathing, evolving expressions of the Earth's restless interior. Lewotobi Laki-Laki is one voice in a chorus of volcanoes that encircle the Pacific. A chorus that has been singing for millions of years. And in 2025, the world was reminded that the song is not finished. The watchful eye, the awakening of the twin mountain in the science of volcanology. There is an uncomfortable truth that practitioners rarely speak aloud. We can observe, we can measure, we can interpret, but we cannot predict with certainty. Every instrument trained on Lewotobi Laki-Laki in the closing months of 2025 was designed to answer a single question: what will the mountain do next? And the mountain, in its patient, geological way, refused to give a simple answer. The monitoring network surrounding the volcano had grown considerably since July. What was once a modest array of seismometers and gas sensors had expanded into one of the most comprehensive volcanic surveillance systems in Indonesia. New seismic stations were installed at varying distances from the crater, creating a three-dimensional map of earthquake activity beneath the mountain. Every tremor, no matter how faint, was recorded. Every shift in the pattern was analyzed. Tiltmeters, sensitive instruments that measure the angle of the ground surface, were positioned on the flanks. If the mountain swelled even a fraction of a degree, a sign that magma was pushing upward, the tiltmeters would detect it. Thermal cameras, mounted on drones and fixed observation posts, scanned the crater continuously. Any increase in heat emission, any new fumarole venting steam, any glow that might indicate rising lava, all would be captured. Satellite imagery, both optical and radar-based, provided a view from above. Radar interferometry, a technique that compares images taken days apart, could detect ground deformation with millimeter precision across the entire mountain. All of this data flowed into computers. Algorithms searched for patterns. Scientists reviewed the results daily, looking for the subtle changes that might herald the next eruption. And what they saw, as 2025 gave way to 2026, was a volcano balanced on the edge of action. The seismic activity remained elevated, not at the frantic levels seen in the hours before the July eruption, but above the baseline. Earthquakes clustered at depths consistent with magma movement. Swarms of small tremors, lasting minutes to hours, suggested fluid movement through cracks in the rock. Gas emissions continued. Sulfur dioxide levels fluctuated, rising and falling over periods of days. High readings indicated fresh magma degassing at depth. Lower readings suggested the system might be stabilizing. The uncertainty was maddening. Ground deformation told, perhaps, the clearest story. The summit was inflating. Slowly, but measurably. Satellite data showed that over the course of 4 months, the ground near the crater had risen by several centimeters. That may not sound significant, but in the language of volcanoes, it is a sentence written in bold letters. Inflation means magma is accumulating. It means pressure is building. It means the system is loading, like a spring being compressed. The question was not whether the spring would release. The question was when. Some scientists, reviewing the data, believed an eruption in early 2026 was likely. The patterns resembled those seen before the July event. The inflation rate was similar. The seismic signatures matched. Others urged caution. Volcanoes, they noted, do not always follow their own precedents. Lewotobi could continue inflating for months, even years, before reaching the threshold for eruption. Or it could release pressure gradually, through smaller venting events, never building to a major explosion. Both interpretations were scientifically valid. Both were consistent with the data. And so, the alert level remained elevated. Not at the highest tier, the one that triggers mandatory evacuations, but high enough to keep emergency services on standby. High enough to remind the population that vigilance was still required. This is the burden of modern volcanology. The science has advanced enormously in recent decades. We can see things now that would have been invisible a generation ago. We can measure processes occurring kilometers beneath the surface. But seeing is not the same as knowing. A volcano is not a machine. It does not operate according to fixed rules. It is a complex, dynamic system influenced by factors we can measure and factors we cannot. The exact composition of the magma, the geometry of the conduit connecting the chamber to the surface, the strength of the rock surrounding the system, the distribution of gases within the melt, all of these variables matter. And not all of them can be observed directly. What monitoring provides is not certainty. It is awareness. It narrows the range of possibilities. It gives communities time, sometimes days, sometimes only hours, to prepare. In the case of Lewotobi Laki-Laki, the monitoring network had done its job in July 2025. The warnings were issued. Most people evacuated in time. Lives were saved. But the next eruption, if it comes, may not provide the same luxury. Some eruptions escalate slowly, giving days of clear warning. Others intensify rapidly, going from minor unrest to full explosion in hours. The scientists watching Lewotobi in early 2026 understood this. They knew that the mountain could surprise them, that all the instruments and expertise in the world could not guarantee perfect foresight. And they knew something else. The people of Flores were growing weary of waiting. Months of elevated alert status take a toll on nerves, on livelihoods, on the collective psychology of a community. Farmers want to plant their fields. Families want to return to homes closer to the volcano. Children want their lives to return to normal. But normal, in the shadow of an active volcano, is a negotiation between human need and geological reality, between the desire for stability and the knowledge that stability, here, is temporary. The scientists could provide data. They could assess risk. They could issue warnings. But the decision of how to live with that risk, that belonged to the people themselves. And as the first months of 2026 unfolded, that decision grew more complex with each passing day of uncertain calm. Because the mountain was still speaking. Quietly, but persistently. And those who knew how to listen understood that the conversation was far from over. There is a photograph taken in the weeks after the July 2025 eruption that captures something words struggle to convey. It shows a farmer standing in his field. Behind him, the twin peaks of Lewotobi rise against a pale sky. The nearer summit, Laki-Laki, the masculine, is still venting a thin plume of steam. The ground at the farmer's feet is covered in ash, grey and lifeless. But in his hands, he holds a seedling. He is planting, not in defiance of the volcano, not in ignorance of the danger, but because this is what people do in places like this. They plant, they rebuild, they continue. This is the reality that statistics and seismic data cannot fully capture. Yes, Lewotobi Laki-Laki erupted in 2025. Yes, it displaced thousands. Yes, it caused economic damage and disrupted lives. Yes, it may erupt again in 2026 or beyond. But it is also true that the soil enriched by volcanic ash has fed generations. That the water flowing from these mountains has sustained communities for centuries. That the landscape, for all its danger, is home, and home is not easily abandoned. As 2026 progressed, life on Flores found its rhythm again. A cautious rhythm, to be sure. One informed by monitoring reports and evacuation plans. But a rhythm nonetheless. Markets reopened. Schools resumed classes. The rice that had been planted in ash-free soil began to grow. The exclusion zone around the crater remained in place. The closest villages, those within 5 kilometers of the summit, stayed empty, their buildings slowly being reclaimed by vegetation. But farther out, beyond the zone of highest danger, people returned. They returned, knowing the mountain could wake again. Knowing that the instruments on its flanks were still recording movement beneath the surface. Knowing that scientists were still watching, still analyzing, still uncertain. They returned anyway. Because this is the bargain humanity has always made with volcanic landscapes. We accept the risk in exchange for the richness. We live in the shadow of fire because the soil it creates is fertile beyond measure. This bargain is as old as agriculture itself. Some of the earliest human settlements were built near volcanoes. The ancient Romans farmed the slopes of Vesuvius. The Maya built cities in the volcanic highlands of Central America. The Japanese have lived with active volcanoes for millennia. We have never stopped, and we likely never will. But the terms of that bargain are changing. In the past, volcanic eruptions were acts of the gods, unpredictable, incomprehensible. Communities either survived or they did not, and there was little that could be done to change the outcome. Today, we have tools. We have monitoring networks. We have evacuation protocols. We have the ability, in many cases, to see eruptions coming, and to move people out of harm's way. This is not a small thing. It represents a fundamental shift in the relationship between humanity and these restless mountains. But it also creates new challenges. How do you maintain vigilance over years or decades? How do you keep communities engaged with preparedness when the danger feels abstract? How do you balance the need for economic development with the reality of volcanic risk? These are questions without easy answers. On Flores, in the months following the 2025 eruption, officials worked to strengthen early warning systems. Sirens were installed in vulnerable villages. Evacuation routes were marked more clearly. Shelters were stocked with supplies. Educational programs were expanded. School children learned about volcanic hazards. Community meetings discussed preparedness. The goal was to create a culture of awareness, where knowledge of the volcano's behavior was as common as knowledge of the weather. But culture changes slowly, and memory fades. The longer Lewotobi Laki-Laki remains quiet, the easier it becomes to forget, to minimize, to believe that the worst is over. This is perhaps the greatest danger of all. Not the eruption itself, but the complacency that precedes it. Scientists studying the volcano in 2026 understood this. They knew that their instruments could detect the next eruption. But instruments cannot guarantee that people will heed the warnings. And so the work continued. The monitoring, the reporting, the patient explanation of risk to communities that had heard it all before and were tired of living in suspense. Because this is the reality of volcanology in the modern age. It is not just a scientific endeavor. It is a human one. It requires communication, trust, the ability to convey uncertainty without causing panic, the ability to maintain vigilance without creating paralysis. It is a long conversation between those who watch the mountain and those who live upon it. A conversation that must be sustained across generations. And Lewotobi Laki-Laki, for its part, continues to participate in that conversation. As of early 2026, the volcano remains restless. The seismic activity has not ceased. The inflation continues. The gas emissions persist. It has not erupted again. Not yet. But the data suggests it is only a matter of time. Whether that time is measured in weeks, months, or years, no one can say with certainty. What is certain is this: the mountain is not finished. The magma beneath it is still accumulating. The pressure is still building. The system remains primed. And when the next eruption comes, and it will come, the world will once again be reminded of a truth we too easily forget. The Earth is still being made. The forces that shaped continents millions of years ago are still at work. Slower than our lives, deeper than our sight, but relentless. Mountains rise. Plates collide. Magma finds its way to the surface. And in that process, landscapes are transformed. We are not separate from this process. We are part of it. We build our cities on the products of ancient eruptions. We farm soils created by volcanic ash. We draw our water from springs fed by volcanic aquifers. The relationship is ancient, and it will continue long after we are gone. Lewotobi Laki-Laki is one voice in that relationship. A voice that spoke loudly in 2025. A voice that may speak again in 2026. But whether it does or not, the conversation continues. Because the planet will keep its ancient rhythm long after we are gone. If you wish to keep walking beside these powerful forces, subscribe to Fury of the Earth, and join us in the next chapter of the planet's unfolding story. The mountains, after all, have much more to say, and those who listen closely will always find themselves humbled by the scale of the story they are witnessing. A story written in fire and time. A story that has no ending. Only the next breath, the next tremor, the next awakening. There is a photograph taken in the weeks after the July 2025 eruption that captures something words struggle to convey. It shows a farmer standing in his field. Behind him, the twin peaks of Lewotobi rise against a pale sky, The nearer summit, Laki-Laki, the masculine, is still venting a thin plume of steam. The ground at the farmer's feet is covered in ash, grey and lifeless. But in his hands, he holds a seedling. He is planting, not in defiance of the volcano, not in ignorance of the danger, but because this is what people do in places like this. They plant, they rebuild, they continue. This is the reality that statistics and seismic data cannot fully capture. Yes, Lewotobi Laki-Laki erupted in 2025. Yes, it displaced thousands. Yes, it caused economic damage and disrupted lives. Yes, it may erupt again in 2026, or beyond. But it is also true that the soil enriched by volcanic ash has fed generations. That the water flowing from these mountains has sustained communities for centuries. That the landscape, for all its danger, is home. And home is not easily abandoned. As 2026 progressed, life on Flores found its rhythm again. A cautious rhythm, to be sure. One informed by monitoring reports and evacuation plans, but a rhythm nonetheless. Markets reopened. Schools resumed classes. The rice that had been planted in ash-free soil began to grow. The exclusion zone around the crater remained in place. The closest villages, those within 5 kilometers of the summit, stayed empty, their buildings slowly being reclaimed by vegetation. But farther out, beyond the zone of highest danger, people returned. They returned knowing the mountain could wake again. Knowing that the instruments on its flanks were still recording movement beneath the surface. Knowing that scientists were still watching, still analyzing, still uncertain. They returned anyway. Because this is the bargain humanity has always made with volcanic landscapes. We accept the risk in exchange for the richness. We live in the shadow of fire because the soil it creates is fertile beyond measure. This bargain is as old as agriculture itself. Some of the earliest human settlements were built near volcanoes. The ancient Romans farmed the slopes of Vesuvius. The Maya built cities in the volcanic highlands of Central America. The Japanese have lived with active volcanoes for millennia. We have never stopped, and we likely never will. But the terms of that bargain are changing. In the past, volcanic eruptions were acts of the gods, unpredictable, incomprehensible. Communities either survived or they did not, and there was little that could be done to change the outcome. Today, we have tools. We have monitoring networks. We have evacuation protocols. We have the ability, in many cases, to see eruptions coming and to move people out of harm's way. This is not a small thing. It represents a fundamental shift in the relationship between humanity and these restless mountains. But it also creates new challenges. How do you maintain vigilance over years or decades? How do you keep communities engaged with preparedness when the danger feels abstract? How do you balance the need for economic development with the reality of volcanic risk? These are questions without easy answers. On Flores, in the months following the 2025 eruption, officials worked to strengthen early warning systems. Sirens were installed in vulnerable villages. Evacuation routes were marked more clearly. Shelters were stocked with supplies. Educational programs were expanded. Schoolchildren learned about volcanic hazards. Community meetings discussed preparedness. The goal was to create a culture of awareness, where knowledge of the volcano's behavior was as common as knowledge of the weather. But culture changes slowly, and memory fades. The longer Lewotobi Laki-Laki remains quiet, the easier it becomes to forget, to minimize, to believe that the worst is over. This is perhaps the greatest danger of all. Not the eruption itself, but the complacency that precedes it. Scientists studying the volcano in 2026 understood this. They knew that their instruments could detect the next eruption. But instruments cannot guarantee that people will heed the warnings. And so the work continued. The monitoring, the reporting, the patient explanation of risk to communities that had heard it all before and were tired of living in suspense. Because this is the reality of volcanology in the modern age. It is not just a scientific endeavor. It is a human one. It requires communication, trust, the ability to convey uncertainty without causing panic, the ability to maintain vigilance without creating paralysis. It is a long conversation between those who watch the mountain and those who live upon it. A conversation that must be sustained across generations. And Lewotobi Laki-Laki, for its part, continues to participate in that conversation. As of early 2026, the volcano remains restless. The seismic activity has not ceased. The inflation continues. The gas emissions persist. It has not erupted again. Not yet. But the data suggests it is only a matter of time. Whether that time is measured in weeks, months, or years, no one can say with certainty. What is certain is this: the mountain is not finished. The magma beneath it is still accumulating. The pressure is still building. The system remains primed. And when the next eruption comes, and it will come, the world will once again be reminded of a truth we too easily forget. The Earth is still being made. The forces that shaped continents millions of years ago are still at work. Slower than our lives, deeper than our sight, but relentless. Mountains rise. Plates collide. Magma finds its way to the surface. And in that process, landscapes are transformed. We are not separate from this process. We are part of it. We build our cities on the products of ancient eruptions. We farm soils created by volcanic ash. We draw our water from springs fed by volcanic aquifers. The relationship is ancient, and it will continue long after we are gone. Lewotobi Laki-Laki is one voice in that relationship. A voice that spoke loudly in 2025. A voice that may speak again in 2026. But whether it does or not, the conversation continues. Because the planet will keep its ancient rhythm long after we are gone. If you wish to keep walking beside these powerful forces, subscribe to Fury of the Earth, and join us in the next chapter of the planet's unfolding story. The mountains, after all, have much more to say. And those who listen closely will always find themselves humbled by the scale of the story they are witnessing. A story written in fire and time. A story that has no ending. Only the next breath. The next tremor. The next awakening.